As you think about all of this change that's happening in robotics today, are there any specific either frameworks that people are changing and how they think about things, or just key technology that is moving things in a new direction?
I think there's a lot of different things that people are thinking about. And up until now, I feel like most everybody's focused on labor cost and activity throughput, right? So that's how you try to build your ROI study, and then and basically left it at labor. And I think now we're starting to see people take into account the warehouse and the cube of the warehouse and how much space there is above, because warehouses are limited to 7 feet high of like effective workspace because our reach and people, and probably realistically 6 feet if you think about it through the lens of ergonomics and safety. And yet all the buildings keep getting taller, and they're living like 36, 38, 40 feet clear. And yet the productive space is like the first 6 feet. And so now there's solutions like when we talked about automated storage and retrieval, they're looking at it through the lens of cubing and getting rid of the racking, getting rid of the aisles, and working vertically in a building. And therefore, you can now shrink a footprint if you start in a greenfield environment. And so instead of needing maybe 1 million square feet of operational space because of using the other 20 some feet that everybody's wasting, they're now saying, hey, I might be able to get away with 200 or 300,000 square feet. So I think people now need to start considering, because buildings got really expensive in the last couple of years because of demand and all the inflationary stuff that's going on there. And the ROI models need to start thinking about square footage cost and how do I take advantage of this space above my first 6 or 7 feet of the warehouse, and how do I make that productive and safe? And so I think that's one component of it. I think the other thing that people forget about when they get so hyper fixated on throughput, they forget about the things that feed that system. And so they don't account for the delay of waiting on, you were talking about in your analysis, like with goods to person, like the picker has to wait for that bot to show up in order to get the item. And people a lot of times forget about that travel time and just think that the person standing there all day doing this and there's like an infinite number of bins just waiting on them, and it's not. And so people do need to account for what is the input or output. Does this new automation need somebody or something to be done before it gets to there? And then does it also feed into this other component? And there's this concept that I hear often called islands of automation, where you automate something but then they're like on these islands and they're separate from each other, and everybody's looking through the perfect lens of my activity and my activity only, but there might be 2 activities before it and 3 activities after it in a chain. And so I think people are starting to realize and figure out there's other things that I got to account for downtime of waiting for the next bin of units to come to me, as an example, or the next bin that goes out from here, it has to go to somebody else. So I think those are the biggest things that people didn't realize in the early days and got caught off guard, and now are changing it for sure.
It's classic drum buffer rope mentality from a factory that comes into fulfillment center. And so I'm just to talk about Nimble a little bit. How have you guys approached those paradigms?
We created a measuring stick that we call raw UPH, or units per hour, that's accounting for the end to end and not just looking at the picking activity or the packing activity, but the shuttle time plus the picking time plus the packing time, so that we can get a real measurement on throughput and number of units that we can productively put through in an hour, accounting for downtime, accounting for wait time, accounting for somebody have to interact with the system or something like that. So I think that's probably the biggest thing, is just rethinking how we measure productivity to be able to account for all that stuff.
So we've talked a lot about robotics in general, but I'd love to think about the practical application of robotics. And so the first question I have for you is, are these sorts of solutions only available to mega shippers like Amazon? And on the other side, like, when is a brand too small to get some of the benefits of robotics?
I don't think they're isolated. I don't think just this is like the story of the biggest of the big. I think there's a handful of reasons why. I think you've got 3PLs that are investing in this because you might be small as a brand, but the 3PL might be big or might have lots of other aggregate volume and light customers that can use it. So I think there's that. There's also the concept of what's called robotics as a service, which many of the robotics companies have gone to market with, where they're creating some type of like an amortization schedule, either pay on a monthly basis or in some of it taken all the way down to a per unit activity. So I pay for pick or I pay for pack or whatever. And so I can look at it through the lens of my activity versus just like upfront having to write some big multi-million dollar check for all the capital and the capex up front, and now we get to spread it out over time. So, and the beauty of that is it allows you to not be obsolete or out to date, which is a lot of this problem we see with automation over the years. Is you throw something in, and basically by the time you get up and running, something new is coming, and is even that same company has already deployed a second level of software or a new version of that software, and now you're like, oh, now what do I do? Versus when you're in this as model, robotics as a service, software as a service, whatever, you're continually getting the latest and greatest. You're always on the latest platform. You're always on the latest hardware. They're accounting for the maintenance and the schedule and providing the expertise and oversight to maintain and deploy those things. And so I think robotics as a service has made it a lot easier. There's also some functionalities that you may not need a lot of. Perfect case in point is something like a palletization or depalletization, where you're building or breaking down pallets somewhere on the dock. If I go into some of these big B2B sites, they may only have 6 lanes, and there might be like 12 pallets being built at any given time, or maybe 3 at every end. So it's like maybe triple that, let's say. Doesn't need a ton of robots to get a lot of payback in there. And then if you have a multi-shift operation, the more shifts you run the same robot on second shift and on third shift, so you get faster payback in there. And then the other thing that's helped out is that integrators have gotten involved. So third parties are working with the robotics companies, are working with the brands, are working with other softwares, and they can deploy these things, and they don't need to deploy tens of millions of these at a time. They're willing to put onesie, twosie installs, but maybe they can also sell a packaging equipment and a software stack and a warehouse maintenance package or something like that. And so as a result, if you just went directly to a robot manufacturer or systems developer or whatever, they might say, hey, I've got to make at least $1 million a year in order for me to justify my expense. But that company, because they're selling other hardware and software capabilities, they could just add on that one robotic arm as an example and build a pallet, but they might create 5 other projects out of it. So I think there's lots of ways where it doesn't always have to be this big solution every time, and smaller to medium-sized customers can get involved. Now, there's some type of a floor level where it makes sense, and an operational profile that makes sense. But in general, I don't think it's just held for the top 5 or 6 companies in the world right now.
That's helpful. I'd love to dig into what you see that ideal operational profile look like for a brand. A quick story, and this isn't fulfillment, but I think it illustrates it well. I remember when I was in Guadalajara, Mexico, looking at factories for a particular brand, and each one of these factories was very proud to show us their automated welding machine. And this thing was cool. It was in the commercials, and it was a robot, and you had sparks everywhere because it was welding, and it was super, super cool. And on every tour, they made a point to that, to say, this is how technologically advanced we are. Like, we can do this. But when you ask them, how often do you run this thing? Or would you be using this for my product? They said, oh, no, this hardly ever runs. Like, it's just there. And so it definitely seemed that the sales guy went from factory to factory and said, hey, so-and-so just bought one. You better buy one too. And he's got a great house somewhere now because of all that. But sometimes I worry about that with fulfillment centers too, where everybody wants to show you the robots and everybody wants to see the robots when you go through there. But then it's a question of, is the brand actually going to use them? Is it actually helpful? So can you talk a little bit about what sorts of profiles are a good candidate for robotics in general, and which ones aren't?
Yeah, if we look at it through the lens of e-commerce and profiles, I think one is SKU profile. If I have 10 SKUs, I can probably use industrial engineering far better than I can use some type of automation equipment or whatever. Like, I can do some type of high velocity, low SKU. I probably do some type of pick to pack. I can put every SKU at every single pack out station. There's no foot traffic, and people are just going back and forth. I can do things like batch processing and batch the orders by SKU type. I can move pallets to pack out. So what we find oftentimes is low SKU counts really don't make a lot of sense to throw automation at it, unless they just have some obnoxious amount of order throughput. But that's not the typical, right? The mid-market e-commerce company, sub $100 million, is not so much volume that it hurts, right? You can still throw that. So we look at it through the lens of SKU complexity, right? Am I going to have to push a cart down multiple aisles if I was in a manual warehouse? The more SKUs there are, the more units per order there are of unique SKUs. Lines per order, you might hear oftentimes referred to as, because now I probably have to walk more aisles in order to complete that order as I'm picking it. Those things seem to be right. So those typically tend to be apparel, footwear, Some nutraceutical brands, even some cosmetic brands have high SKU counts, but those are the areas that we tend to chase after, and it's primarily because of the SKU complexity. And then secondly, it's because of the size. We get great storage density out of them. We can put lots of units per tote and really maximize that vertical storage piece. And then the dynamic slotting helps us. We look at a lot of things through the lens of what we call peanut butter and jelly SKUs. The old saying is, if I buy peanut butter, I buy jelly, right? So there's some correlation or commonality in a lot of brand SKUs. And so we want to look at that data and then have them be placed adjacent to each other. So if I bring a tote out to pick an order, I have a much higher likelihood of completing that order through one bin presentation than having to have two bin presentations as an example. So for me and what we do, SKU profile is one. And then secondly, kitting is probably still best done in a workstation environment with the people involved with it, just because you've had lots of past life experience with kitting, and you can build a table or you can build a conveyor line. There's lots of ways to do this, but robotic picking and stuff like that doesn't make a ton of sense. Now, it can make sense in that you may not have to pre-kit because the robotics automation can pick much cheaper and more effectively. So there are scenarios where we've avoided pre-kitting in some of our things, but where pre-kitting is a requirement, a must-have, it's probably not going to make sense to throw an automation solution at it beyond the conveyor belt, candidly.
One thing I just want to make sure I heard correctly is it sounds like you guys are inherently going after some less desirable volume, right? So really around high SKU count. Did I have that right?
Yes. Now, my operator might tell you something differently, but I think that's where we bring the greatest value, because if you unwind this to the lowest tech 3PL environment, they're going to be pushing a cart up and down the aisle. If you take it to the second level of tech 3PL provider, there's going to be some type of automated bot meeting pickers in aisles and moving stuff around, and there's going to be lots of aisles. And we think we create a ton of advantage in there because I can do all of that pick process without people. So I don't have steps. Also, in their aisles, they need to run carts up or run bots up and down. I can put another several 100,000 SKUs in there. So I optimize that building a little bit better. So yes, we think we bring a ton of value in those spaces, because the more SKUs, the more units per order, the more complex it is, and the more we see the throughput in units per hour go way down in a more manual operation. So everybody would love the perfect profile. If we could get away with doing 10 SKU single unit orders, like, we would love to. The problem is non-automated companies can do that really well. And so in order to build our moat, so to speak, we find that the complexity becomes a moat for us because of the pick paths and the other robotic solutions that come into play to typically do that. It allows us to compete with at a higher unit throughput and much less people involved to get it to the pack out station.
Yeah, it's really interesting counter positioning there, because at the end of the day, fulfillment is a revenue per square foot sort of game. And the number of fulfillment centers who will tell me, hey, we'd love to ship $200 cosmetics that are about the size of your thumb, and we want to do 10,000 shipments a day of just those. I'm like, I get you. Like, everyone wants to do that. I'll do that in my basement.